Hi everyone, #1 Marmaduke fan here, looking at Udon's Manga Classics edition of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Obviously a classic novel in the English language. This manga adaptation, the art is by Posey, and the story adaptation is by Stacey King. This is a high recommendation. Earlier, the first one from the Manga Classic series I reviewed was Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and I called that a perfect manga. It was one of my favorite comics of the year. Absolutely one of the most beautiful comics I've ever read in my life. Sense and Sensibility, this is a solid comic. I'm recommending it. At first I was kind of like getting OCD and like saying, I don't know. But then I started getting more and more into it, and they earned their recommendation. So since I'm OCD, I'll probably talk about my tiny little quibbles, but I can warmly recommend this to you. Now, of course, I will talk about the comic art and the adaptation a little bit, but I mostly want to talk about Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. And I've been kicking around so many titles for this video, which express what I want to express, but it's almost like they're too crude to express the point. So I was thinking, every red pill dude bro should read Sense and Sensibility. Yeah, every incel should read Sense and Sensibility. Every third wave feminist should read Sense and Sensibility, right? So the point is that Jane Austen sort of transcends crude politics. The issues she talks about are so good and so powerful, but at the same time, because they're such great universal ideas, you can read something like Sense and Sensibility and immediately start making applications to things. So I think the rough point is that I read the actual novel in high school along with Pride and Prejudice. I didn't really fall in love with Jane Austen until college, where I performed a role in a theatrical production of Persuasion, which is one of her lesser known novels. So if you're kind of intimidated by the big, thick books about, English romance and ballroom politics, Persuasion is a short little novella. It's got one of the most compelling female characters ever because she makes a mistake. She wants to fix her mistake. Jane Austen wrote female characters who had agency and moral virtue and had dimensions and an internal. Like the NPC meme. The NPC meme is partially making fun of fake news, but the NPC meme is also making fun of people who don't have an internal monologue and think through what they say or think about what other people say to them. Jane Austen wrote anti-NPC characters. See, that's the problem, is there are so many contemporary little things you could connect Sense and Sensibility to, because it's something that every guy who likes to watch robots smash into each other in big explosions like me, you still got to read Sense and Sensibility. You got to get over your assumptions that it's a silly romance novel or about boring English politics, and you have got to internalize the point of this book. The reason I was thinking about third wave feminists is Jane Austen, of course, is a person who has almost universal appeal. You can be a far leftist and fall in love with the world described by Jane Austen, fall in love with her characters, fall in love with the complexity of the things she would observe. She was a genius. But I think the question posed by a book like Sense and Sensibility is, can a book like Sense and Sensibility and its moral message survive in our culture? Are we going to leave behind things like Sense and Sensibility, which I think should be part of our shared culture and shared heritage, and move on to some new worldview, some undefined world, which is at odds with the fundamental moral tie in a book like Sense and Sensibility? So I'm of course thinking of intersectional feminists, the new left, and who are predominantly on college campuses teaching intersectional theory in relation to art history, like the history of painting, and in relation to fiction. Part of what's prompted this is I'm upset about a couple things. This week, my boy, that umbrella guy, he got doxxed and someone called his place of work because he's involved in Comicsgate. I had a conversation with a comics professional who's a critic of Comicsgate, but not a radical leftist. And what both of these conversations boiled down to is, well, for me, what's important is, what are these cultural issues about? What is Comicsgate about? What is Gamergate about? They're not just about petty debates on Twitter. They are about fundamental moral issues. And I think all of us recognize this, even if we have a hard time articulating it. And books like Sense and Sensibility give us a chance to articulate these fundamental moral virtues that are eternal and universal and transcend, feminist versus incel, MRA kind of stuff. I don't know. So, all right, that was a glorious tangent, but now let's try to get into it. Okay, here is the question I have for any progressive, any advocate of social justice, anyone who identifies as a third wave feminist or an intersectional feminist. If you love the world of Jane Austen, is all you love the pageantry and the fancy outfits of Victorian England, or do you love the wisdom contained in Jane Austen? And if you love the wisdom contained in Jane Austen, are you comfortable with a world where she's not just declared problematic, like there's just like a few little problematic things in it that, well, we wish we could tweak, she was a product of her time, but are you okay with a rejection of the fundamental points that Jane Austen is trying to make in her novels? Are you comfortable with living in a world where the morality of a person like Jane Austen would be seen as something to be discarded, something to be deconstructed, and for a new world to be created where Jane Austen wouldn't be seen as part of our shared culture anymore? Because when I look at the New Left, what I look at is not just a critique of the past, but a rejection of the past in lieu of some future utopia where there's no clarity on what that utopia is going to be. And the beauty of an Austen is that she transcends the hot topic, Trump or no Trump, of the day. This is an idea, a view of the world that we just need. I read Ruth this week, and I think that Jane Austen, because she grew up in Christian England, probably read and reread the Book of Ruth, and she understood like the key ideas in the Book of Ruth, and so she internalized that. And so then when she looked at English society of her day, she was able to critique the English society of her day, but she kind of brought with her the thoughts she had about like a person like Ruth. So I see both of these characters as kind of a musing on that fundamental moral idea, that the point of Ruth is that she worships God, she is loyal to Naomi, her mother-in-law, and Ruth's morality, her loyalty, impresses Boaz. Boaz is the son of Rahab, the prostitute, who was in Jericho, right? So one generation after Joshua was, oops, I blocked my microphone. One generation after Joshua was like slaughtering everybody in order to claim the promised land, Ruth, who is a Moabite, who is a foreigner, comes into Jerusalem following Naomi, worshiping the one true God, but Ruth's a foreigner, and yet through her moral courage is able to win Boaz. It's an amazing story. Jane Austen's stories are about women learning moral virtue and learning the value of the male perspective so that they can become worthy of being a good wife. It's not about just like tee-hee. You might look at this and think, oh, it's a tee-hee little romance. It's not. It is everything that's beautiful about good heroic male perspective stories from a female perspective. And that's why I say she was a genius. She never married. I think maybe she was like too genius for anyone in her day to get her. She was someone who was so observant. She paid attention to human beings. She paid attention to men and was able to facilitate her observations into a story that everyone needs to read. All right, that's my pitch on Sense and Sensibility for 8 minutes. Oh boy, tangents. But this is important because pretty much the takeaway is if you haven't read Jane Austen yet, you really need to, because I think it'll speak to everything that you worry about in just petty politics of the day. And if you have read Jane Austen and you kind of enjoyed the pageantry, revisit it and take another good hard look. Okay, I marked this page because this was where I was kind of being OCD. I think the weakness of the artist is facial construction. There are often faces where like the eyes are kind of floating where they're not supposed to be, but what I will say is I think this successfully brings in sort of shoujo romantic visual language into Jane Austen. And I love the idea of a shoujo manga based on a Jane Austen story because without Jane Austen, we wouldn't have shoujo manga. Really, shoujo manga has developed a visual language to communicate the kind of romantic feelings that Jane Austen understood psychologically. So despite like maybe some weakness in the art, I think it's ultimately successful at immersing you into this world and making it seem fun and fantastic and beautiful. The writing adaptation, it's good. You know, it's very straightforward. It does what it needs to do. And for that, I give this adaptation credit for doing what an adaptation should, is to bring a story into a new format, recognize what's important about the original story, recognize what's key about the new format, and make them work together. So in that sense, this is a successful adaptation. There are little moments that are awkward where I think that this might have been editorial, where clearly the artist intended for him to be saying something here, but there's no speech balloon, and so then this becomes like an awkward pause, and it's not like a good pregnant pause where they're building drama. It's just like clearly there was supposed to be a comment right there that got left out. And there are a few moments like that triggered my OCD, but then pretty much right after that, I stopped worrying so much about little, oh, this page is a little funky in its composition. I just got into it, which I think is mostly due to the power of Jane Austen's original and their ability to facilitate that. This is an example of a good use of shoujo sensibility to underscore the emotional significance. So pain and loss, and so like they use a simple visual metaphor like writhing vines and thorns to illustrate that emotional reality. So yeah, that's the only thing I want to say about it. It's comic art. It's really decent. I still like the manga classics adaptation of The Scarlet Letter. That's one of the greatest comics I've ever read. And this is a really good entry. So pretty much 2 entries in, I am so happy this series exists, and I want to support and read all of the Udine manga classics I can possibly get my hand on. So I want to fast forward a bit. There's movie adaptations of Sense and Sensibility. There's all kind of stuff about it. The point I'm trying to get at is the moral power that Jane Austen is trying to articulate is so universal and so meaningful. Everyone needs to facilitate this into their lives. And if you do facilitate it into your life, it's like, who cares about intersectionalism? Intersectionalism and heteronormativity, none of that can speak to you in as meaningful and powerful way as this does. So what's going on? Hold on, I need a refresher because I've just been getting so excited. All right, so... gosh, I completely forgot what Sense and Sensibility was about. I got so excited. But the point is, I gotta really organize my thoughts better before I jump into one of these. All right, here's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to read to you some of this so that you can just sort of hear Jane Austen speaking to you. So this is like after the climax, so I guess spoilers for Sense and Sensibility. Sorry, this is after they've wrapped up most of like the romantic interests, and the characters have kind of learned their lessons. That they began, one was very logical and very practical, one was very emotional and romantic, and she sort of learned to appreciate her sister's moral courage and her virtue and the value of being practical and using logic. The older sister has always loved her younger sister, and she's kind of learned to, she's always been, dang it, I really should have just written down their names so I had a cheat card for it. Okay, the point is you'll learn a lot about life from these characters, and it's complicated, it's 3-dimensional, it's not cheesy little doofiness. All right. So, Marianne, Eleanor. Eleanor's the logical one. Marianne is the romantic one. She's the one with sensibility. Eleanor is the one with sense and logic. All right. See, when I slow down and I control the tangents, I can get there. Marianne and Eleanor. All right. Marianne has sort of learned her lesson, and she's learned to value Eleanor's logical perspective. She's looking back on Willoughby, the cad who broke her heart, who she believed was the dashing, handsome, gallant man who she would fall in love with, because Marianne was governed by her sort of childish, romantic ideas. And so after the pain of losing Willoughby, she's grown as a person. I am done with regret, at least towards him, although I do truly wonder if he was as wicked as he seemed. Eleanor asked, do you compare your conduct with his? I compare it with what it ought to have been. I compare it with yours. Marianne is not an NPC. She thinks about what happens to her. She looks at the conduct of others, and she begins to understand her moral failings and to change herself according to those moral failings, to follow the moral path her older sister has taken. So Eleanor says, our situations were very different. My illness made me think, because she's not an NPC, she's thinking, I have been selfish and inconsiderate and wronged those who love me best. So she's not thinking about, oh, patriarchy, privilege everywhere. I've got to check everyone's privilege. She is internalizing her flaws and learning to appreciate all the people in her family with more respect. But I have a plan. I have my plan. My feelings shall be governed and my temper improved. So she's learned that facts don't care about her feelings, pretty much. She's still the same romantic, artistic, wonderful, enthusiastic, vivacious person. But she has learned to let logic and experience and wisdom guide her more than her flighty emotions. I will live solely for my family, for you will be all the world to me. As for Willoughby, I shall never forget him. See, she doesn't stop being the romantic person she is. She hasn't brain transplanted to become a different person. She's still that, young, enthusiastic girl she always was. But his memory will be regulated by religion and by reason. If I could but know his heart, everything would become easy. So what Eleanor knows is that Willoughby was a cad and a sinner, but he wasn't as evil as she first thought him to be. So she sort of explains the difficulty of Willoughby's situation, and this sort of gives Marianne the closure that she needed to kind of say goodbye to Willoughby and move on with her life. Then they kind of reflect on Willoughby and the damage he kind of did to her heart. He broke her heart. So Willoughby, they learn, fornicated and produced a child out of wedlock, and he abandoned the woman to her death, which is an evil thing. And Willoughby is suffering because of that sin. And then they reflect on the significance of this. And this is where Austen's, I think, Christian worldview is coming through, and this is what holds together her critique of the world she lived in. So if the intersectionalist would look at this book and say, Jane Austen is criticizing the patriarchy, which prevents women from inheriting property due to capitalist interest in property rights, and while ignoring the victims of English colonialization, because Jane Austen was a beneficiary of white capitalist privilege or something. Right? If that's the intersectionalist view of this book, which robs it of its emotional power and its joy and its purpose and its wisdom, then there's no way to explain this sequence of events through the intersectionalist worldview, except to say, oh, well, it's Christian patriarchy. So that's not the part we're interested in. We're interested in the good feminist stuff where she's criticizing British property inheritance law. It's important that Jane Austen did that because she was smart. She was able to criticize the culture she lived in. But this is the key fundamental takeaway from Jane Austen. This is what is at odds with the New Left. Okay, to think Willoughby capable of such things, so they're talking about his fornication and abandoning the woman to death. It is a great relief to me to know the truth. I could never have been happy with him. Happy with a libertine? No, certainly not. So here's Eleanor. This is the closest we'll get to like a PSA, like looking out to the kids and explaining to us what's important. The whole of his behavior has been selfish. True, my happiness was never his object. Eleanor says he regrets what he has done, but only because it has not made him happy. Having money, he values more highly that which he has lost, an amiable wife. Were circumstances reversed, he would believe money was the more important of the two. Now, what's interesting about this is the theme of redemption. Willoughby is a cad. He's an awful person, but his remorse over the evil he did, even though his evil has kind of condemned him to an unhappy marriage, even for Willoughby, there's redemption. That the very fact that he's remorseful over his sin means that he can at least find some happiness, even though he's regretful that his sin destroyed his opportunity to have happiness with Marianne, the woman he loved. So even for the villains, they get redemption. But for the protagonists, for the characters who we've been rooting for, good triumphs over evil. There's a happy ending, but the happy ending has emotional resonance because we've read all of this of them going through suffering. So even though they're like rich, privileged English, lords and ladies, they encounter suffering, and you identify with it because this is the pageantry is fun. The beautiful costumes and the English language and the romance of the world is all fun. But we connect with it because we we still experience things like this, and we still suffer problems like this. And don't if you don't become like an Eleanor, you're going to be an NPC and just walk through your life not knowing what the heck's going on. You learn from these characters how to reflect on your own decisions and make good decisions rather than decisions that'll ruin your life forever. So, boy, if you have no idea what's going on, read the original first. I did enjoy this manga adaptation. Read Jane Austen. You're going to have to sit down and get through it, but you will come out of the end of it a wiser person. And if you just can't make yourself sit through that language, if it's just too much of a struggle for you, okay, fine. Read this manga first as kind of your introduction to the basics of it. Then go read Jane Austen, and you'll be a better person for it. I really appreciated everything that the artist and author had to say about the adaptation process. I really loved looking at their notes on how to depict the characters in such a way as to indicate their personalities and their symbolic significance. Like Willoughby has one of his eyes covered by his hair because he's not an entirely trustworthy person. Every romantic story ever has pulled from Jane Austen to some degree, but that doesn't mean they understood what the whole point of Jane Austen was when they did it. Like if Frozen, I don't like Frozen that much. I know a lot of people are really starting to critique it now that, MRA feminist stuff has become like a really popular topic. I just thought it was an okay movie with just some... It didn't have a lot of emotional power that I thought would be eternal, Frozen, right? So Frozen, you could say, steals from Jane Austen that it has the heroic, handsome, dashing man who heroically shows up in the beginning and is revealed to be an evil cad. But in the movie, it just feels ham-fisted and like, oh, gee, the handsome guy is an evil dude. Surprise, surprise. In the context of this world, it all has emotional resonance that speaks to you. I love these character sketches. So, golly gee willikers, I am so happy that Udon is doing the manga classics. It's doing more than Classics Illustrated. So Classics Illustrated, everyone probably read some Classics Illustrated growing up. They were fun little comic book adaptations of great works of literature. I read a bunch of them growing up. I'm nostalgic for a bunch of them. But I think the problem is, 20 pages or 30 pages of comic book isn't enough to capture a 300-page book. This still isn't enough to capture the full impact of Sense and Sensibility. But I think by what Udon is doing with manga classics, it is beautifully taking these powerful stories and connecting them with artists that add to the emotional impact of the original in a way that young people understand. Young people get the conventions of shoujo manga if they've just read a few shoujo manga, and it's a beautiful addition to Jane Austen to bring that sensibility into her work. This is a great series. I'm going to get all of it and support it. And I high recommend for any young person who you're trying to introduce into the classics of English literature. I think this series is it's doing a better job than Classics Illustrated of that, because it's actually long enough to touch on the powerful themes that is the real draw. Like when I was young, I liked Classics Illustrated, but I quickly figured out, oh, wait a second, the real books are better. The real good stuff's in the books. They're getting enough of the good stuff out of the books that a kid will feel the whammy of it. This is great stuff. All right, so Udon, manga classics, amazing. As good as it's possible to be, to take already powerful, beautiful stories from our history and add art and sort of contemporary artistic sensibilities to those stories. Everybody needs to read this in the culture war. We will understand each other better in the culture war if we can have something shared like Sense and Sensibility and the moral virtue of Jane Austen guiding our discussions. And that is what I think, that is why I am not too afraid of the new left, turning us into like an intersectional safe space, because there's no way for that worldview to interact with what makes Sense and Sensibility an eternal story. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys. I love my patrons on Patreon, and I'll catch you later.